Hello everybody, welcome to Solid Rock, where we stress test the Gospels. My name is Mate De Brossi and I'm here with, I'll be talking to my friend and neighbor Peter Murfitt. So last time we dealt with the literary nature or the genre of the Gospels. We concluded that they are historically reliable, that they are biographies of Jesus, written in Greek and Roman style of the times, and 3, that they are based on eyewitness testimony. So, Peter, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, today we'll be looking at the method we shall use to determine the origins of the Gospels, and we shall apply it to Luke and to the Acts of the Apostles. But first of all, we have to make 2 ground clearing points to begin with.
What are these 2?
Well, you may remember from last time that we found that some biblical scholars don't believe that God intervenes in history or in the miracles of Jesus. This means too that Jesus could not have prophesied about any future events. However, Matthew, Mark and Luke all talk about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which occurred under the command of Titus in AD 70. For these commentators, it means that these 3 Gospels must have been written after AD 70, which of course makes the Gospel writers into cheats. However, if we accept that Jesus could have prophesied about these things so that his followers could discern the signs and escape from the coming terror, then these passages strongly suggest that all 3 Gospels were written before AD 70. And Darren Bock, who has written a commentary on the Gospel of Luke of over 2,000 pages, which I happen to have upstairs, even suggests that the destruction of the temple was foreseeable. He concludes, along with many others, like me, that Matthew, Mark and Luke were all written before AD 70.
Okay, so that's the first ground clearing point. What about the second one?
Well, in a minute, I will introduce a logical way of determining the origin of the Gospels. But it's extremely frustrating when you read commentaries on the Gospels because they start off logically, looking at the historical sources and so on, and then suddenly halfway through they say, yes, but Mark must have been written first. Now, whether they are right or wrong is not the issue, but the fact is that they've destroyed the logical sequence of their argument.
I see. So what's the method that you propose, Peter, for determining the origins of the Gospels?
Well, the first 2 parts of my method are used by most researchers in Gospel studies. Firstly, we examine the evidence from the Gospels themselves, what the documents themselves say. These are what historians and theologians call internal evidence. Secondly, we then use what we can glean from the Acts of the Apostles, from the New Testament letters, and from the historians such as Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, Irenaeus, Papias, and Eusebius, and that's external evidence.
Okay, so internal evidence, looking at the documents, external evidence. So you add a 3rd step.
Yeah, I attempt to trace the whereabouts of the important major figures involved, like Peter, Paul, Mark, Luke, Silas, etc., in timeline charts. Because, as we all know from watching police series on television, if a criminal wants to commit a crime, he has to have the motive, the means, the opportunity. In the same way, the Gospel writers have to have the motive, the means, and the opportunity.
So surely the motive doesn't seem to represent a problem. We've seen that the writers were writing these biographies because they wanted the world to know about Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. That was their fundamental motivation. However, we shall see as we go through that each one of them had his own individual reasons for writing exactly when he did.
Yeah, so in any case, these timeline charts enable us to zero in on the means and the opportunity.
Yes, that's it. And then there's another tool which Richard Bauckham introduced, which is called inclusio evidence. An author underlines the importance of the testimony of a person by citing his or her name as the first and the last person in the document. So this is another form of internal evidence.
Okay, so why have we linked Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles together?
Excellent question, Matty. Just about everyone accepts that Luke and Acts were written by the same person because of an essential person of internal evidence from the two works. Introductions to Luke's Gospel and Acts show huge similarities, and both books are addressed to a person unknown called Theophilus. So maybe you could read the two passages to us, Matty.
With pleasure. Here we go. So the first passage is from Luke, and the second passage will be from the Acts, so the Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So this is from Luke chapter 1, and the next is from Acts. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the Gospels he had chosen. After his suffering, he showed himself to these men and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive.
You see the similarities and the fact that Acts is in fact the sequel to the Gospel of Luke.
That's pretty clear.
Now, if we carry on looking at the internal evidence from Luke's Gospel and Acts, we discover some other interesting points. From the introduction to the Gospel, which you've just read, we find that Luke claims to have based his Gospel on eyewitness testimony without being an eyewitness himself. On the other hand, in Acts, there are some passages that we know as the we passages, which are written in the first person plural rather than third person plural. So in these passages, Luke is himself the eyewitness. It also enables us to learn things about the author. Paul left him behind at Philippi to pastor the fledgling church. He is with Paul during his imprisonment in Caesarea and on the journey to Rome for trial before Nero. Irenaeus says that Luke and Paul were inseparable.
So is there any inclusio evidence in Luke's Gospel?
Yes, there is. Peter is the first and the last disciple to be mentioned, which suggests that the author is acknowledging his indebtedness to the testimony of Peter. And there is an inclusio concerning some of the women around Jesus, suggesting that Luke used their eyewitness testimony.
Okay, wow, I wasn't aware of that. So far we've dealt with the method and the internal evidence. You've explained these. What about external evidence from historians and so on?
Well, it turns out that the timing of Paul's imprisonment with Luke at Caesarea can be known with precision by cross-checking with Josephus and with coins of the time. The Roman procurator Felix kept Paul in prison for 2 years, but his successor, Porcius Festus, dealt with the matter swiftly in July 59 AD. The shipwreck on Malta occurred after the Day of Atonement in October 59. This means that Paul and Luke arrived in Rome in February AD 60, and Paul was under house arrest until December AD 61.
There's quite a lot of detailed evidence in terms of the timeline. But what else does the external evidence tell us?
Well, Eusebius tells us that Paul was released after his first trial in Rome and resumed preaching. And there are all sorts of other numerous other historical grounds for supposing that this is true, but we don't have the time to go into it. For more details, you should look at the book Solid Rock Stress Testing the Gospels, chapter 6. Now, Peter and Paul both met their deaths in AD 64-65 at the height of Nero's persecution of the Christians in Rome. Both Eusebius and Irenaeus attribute Luke and Acts to Luke. Eusebius adds that Luke was born in Antioch in Syria, while Colossians 4 verse 14 informs us that Luke was a doctor. Then there are other people who back all these things up. Justin Martyr speaks of Luke writing a memoir of Jesus. The Muratorian canon 170 to 180 AD attributes the Gospel to Luke, who was Paul's companion, and the anti-Marcionite prologue to the third Gospel, that's 175 AD, attributes both Luke and Acts to Luke, the physician from Antioch.
So this is quite a lot of information. So what happens when we synthesize all this together?
Well, both Luke's Gospel and Acts were written by Luke, an inseparable companion of Paul, who was born in Antioch in Syria. He was a doctor, non-Jewish. For a time he pastored the fledgling church at Philippi. Luke was an eyewitness for much of Acts, but not for his Gospel. And here he used the testimony of other eyewitnesses.
So what about the Acts? When and where were the Acts written?
Well, since Paul and Luke were inseparable, it's inconceivable that if Paul was already dead, that Luke would not have mentioned the death of his hero in Acts.
Yes.
Therefore, Acts must have been written before AD 64-65. Thus, we follow Eusebius and conclude that Luke wrote Acts during Paul's period of house arrest in Rome between February 60 and December 61.
But when did Luke write his Gospels?
Well, we recall that Luke has to have the means, that is the access to eyewitnesses, and the opportunity, the time to research and the time to write. It seems highly probable that while Luke was with Paul in Caesarea, he had a chance to interview his Palestinian and especially his women witnesses. He would then have been able to consult Philip the Evangelist, who also lived in Caesarea, for both his Gospel and Acts. Therefore, Luke probably had an embryonic form of his Gospel at the beginning of AD 59. Then he added final touches to it when he got to Rome in February AD 60, and he encountered Peter.
So this means that both the Acts and Luke's Gospels in their final form were probably written in Rome between February 60 and December 61. Is that right?
Yeah, or maybe between February 60 and February 62, if we assume that Paul took about 2 months to get back on the preaching trail once he'd been released from house arrest.
This sounds pretty cast iron. That's solid.
Yes, it is. No one who looks at the external evidence with an open mind can come to any other conclusion. The timeline charts and the inclusio evidence just confirm it all.
Okay, so let's sum this up. Both Luke and Acts were written in Rome between February 60 and February 62 by Luke himself, who was a non-Jewish doctor born in Antioch in Syria. He was the inseparable companion of the Apostle Paul. He pastored the fledgling church in Philippi for a time. He was an eyewitness for much of Acts, but for his Gospels he used the testimony of other eyewitnesses, notably that of Peter and the woman who had been around Jesus. Yes,
that's right. That's all correct. And we haven't touched on the fact that Acts is the work of a fine first-class historian, where a fantastic number of the details are borne out by the findings of archaeology.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. I think we've seen how the method works. We first examine the internal evidence and the external evidence, construct a timeline chart to trace where the various important people are, and then we look at the inclusio evidence. And then the whole thing is synthesized and put together. And we've discovered that the origins of Luke and Acts are really rock solid.
That's right.
Okay, so what's up for next time?
Well, next time we should be getting near Easter, so we should probably have a look at the Gospel accounts of the death of Jesus and what the archaeology in Jerusalem can tell us about it.
Excellent, sounds good to me. See you next time. See you next time, everybody. And thank you for watching. God bless.